morning to one and all who is present in this very special online lecture by a very long time friend and a huge pillar of support for the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at MAHE, Dr. V. Siddhartha. Anyone who follows the intersection between science and diplomacy or science and strategy, Dr. V. Siddhartha is not a stranger to them. And ever since I joined this department roughly 7 years back, either in some conferences organized by the department or conferences organized in Manipal by the department, Dr. V. Siddhartha has been a constant presence, a very regular speaker, and we as a department have learned immensely, as I'm very sure we will do today as well, from his very innovative and sometimes really out of the box thinking as far as the interlinkages between SNT and geopolitics or IR at large is concerned. It's a great honor for us, sir, to have you here at the department due to the COVID situation. We are having this in an online mode, and we hope that things improve fast and we will have you again in person at the department to interact with this young crowd of students who, as Dr. Anand regularly exposed to traditional understandings and notions of IR and geopolitics, but the kind of thinking and the kind of writing and the kind of speaking, imparting of knowledge that you do, I think it's really interesting and will add new dimensions to their understanding of this intersection between science and diplomacy. So welcome to you, sir, again, and I welcome all my colleagues who are present today, all the external participants who have joined us through the online mode, to all the students of the department. And I really look forward to this lecture and the discussion that will follow thereafter. And I encourage all the students to make use of this opportunity and engage as much as possible with Dr. V. Siddhartha. My colleague, Dr. Anand V., who is the moderator of the session, will give a formal introduction and will carry forward the lecture and the discussion. Now the floor is yours, Anand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Munish, for your welcome remarks. First of all, I'm really pleased to introduce to all of you Dr. V. Siddhartha, who's an adjunct faculty at the International Strategic and Security Studies program at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru. Dr. Siddhartha, during 2007-9, served on invitation of the Secretary General of the United Nations as a member of the expert group in New York of the Committee on UN Security Council Resolution 1540. Upon returning from the mission, he served in the during 2009-10 with the principal scientific advisor to the Government of India as a scientific consultant on advanced technologies. An emeritus scientist in DRDO, he retired in 2004 after working directly with 4 scientific advisors to the Raksha Mantri over nearly 20 years. Dr. Siddhartha has been twice consultant to the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, on export control and science and technology issues in international security, and on the Indian WMD Act of 2005. Dr. Siddhartha has also served with the United Nations Environment Program in Geneva. He served for some time as the Secretary of the Science Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. He holds a PhD from the Imperial College of Science and Technology, London, and a BTech in Mechanical Engineering from IIT Madras. He has served with different arms of the nation's SNT system, including the Indian Space Research Organization, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, the Defense Research and Development Organization, as well as the Department of Science and Technology. Dr. Siddhartha is a founder member of the Institute of Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru. He is a member of the Aeronautical Society of India and of the United Service Institution of India, as also of several technology associations and bodies. He was a research fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, UK. He has served on the editorial board of the journal Current Science of the Indian Academy of Sciences. With this introduction, I will not stand before you and Dr. Siddhartha's lecture. So I would like to invite Dr. Siddhartha to deliver his distinguished online lecture to the department. Thank you. Dr. Siddhartha, you may please start your lecture. I'll be sharing the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for that entirely undeserved introduction. True as it might well be. And I, of course, have always enjoyed my trips to Manipal, and I'm very disappointed that I haven't been able to make it there this time. I think I was deliberately kept away. I'm fairly certain. I think this is an excuse to keep me away from all of you. But never mind. So, if I might begin the presentation that I was going to make. I call this the Lexicons of Science Diplomacy. Now the next slide, I think, explains what I mean by that and why I've chosen this particular title. Now the next slide, please. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, next slide, please.
Yeah, I already changed the slide.
Yeah. Okay, so it takes time to. Apparently, the delay is in the speed of light, but never mind.
Can you see it now?
So now, fine. Yeah, right. It's come up to the theme. Then the theme that I intend to sort of elaborate on is as follows: diplomacy, as one is taught at entry into any training school for diplomats, is the primary means of statecraft designed to affect the non-military ends of the state, as distinct, of course, from the military ends, which are affected by the militaries. Science diplomacy, again within quotes, discussing science and scientists to the practice of diplomacy. It came to prominence when scientists smoothened diplomatic negotiations between the principal Cold War adversaries, the United States and then Soviet Union, to shape the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NNPT or the NPT, and other arms control treaties that have been negotiated between these superpowers since that time. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Yes, sir, I've changed it.
Yeah, okay. Okay, sorry, it obviously takes time. Now, the irony in that legacy, that is the Cold War legacy, was actually, it was apparent even then, and I'll come to that possibly in discussion, but maybe even earlier. Now, it is ironic that the NNPT was negotiated in the late 60s between adversarial superpowers to give effect to their shared interest to stymie and control the spread of nuclear weapons and their enabling technologies to, in particular, the states of the global south. And for those of you who are perspicacious enough, they'll realize that this really, allegedly a north-south divide, is actually a color divide between the whites who got together and said, look, unless we get together, browns, blacks, and yellows are going to start asserting themselves. So that, at any rate, is the way I have looked at it in the past, and hope to convince you, if I may, that the leitmotif of that undercurrent of racist attitudes continue. So it's no surprise that one finds quasi-military epithets for scientific diplomacy in some North media, such as un coup gagnant de la diplomatique scientifique de la France, a winning shot of scientific diplomacy of France. Clearly a military epithet that is being used for something which ought not to have that kind of connotation in the first place. Next slide, please.
Yes.
Therefore, given those origins and modes of the use of such expressions as science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, science for diplomacy, you will find these bandied about, and in some cases even attempts are made that this should be the kind of standard terminology, for example, by the AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which many of you have probably surfed their website and found the science diplomacy or the science for diplomacy subsite on their site. Then the Royal Society of Britain has adopted it, not surprisingly, Anglo-Saxons after all. And the French are still struggling with it. They're trying to be different, as I've just explained. Not so sure they're going to be very successful. The EU, the European Union, has its own science diplomacy division as part of its Science and Technology Directorate. And I would urge the young students who might be looking at this, listening to it, to go to those to understand, and given to understand, have been shared with in this lecture by the department. So do visit those sites and get a hang of what they're at. Anyway, I eschew the use of these expressions in the lexicons of science diplomacy, if only to preempt neo-colonial attitudes creeping into our S&T engagements with co-South states. And therefore, I don't even use science diplomacy. I prefer this team descriptor, science in diplomacy.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to make a morphological distinction, and I think this needs to be made. And you will note that this is made, at least with this clarity, in all those other descriptions for other obvious reasons. Well, maybe not obvious. Clearly, they want to merge these two as part of their, shall we say, attitude towards the use of diplomacy in science and international collaboration in science, so that this distinction is not made. So I insist that distinction should be made, and that these are international collaborations in scientific and technological fields, on the one hand, and S&T in foreign policy, which is different. S&T in foreign policy occurs, or is salient, when the findings of science or the use of technology may have ramifications for international relations beyond the S&T themselves. Then the pursuit of the S, the science, or the control of the use, the limit of the denial of use even of self-developed technology, are influenced by foreign policy, international relations, and power relations between nation states, in particular the nation states of the North. Next slide, please.
Yes.
So there are two different ways in which we have used in India S&T in diplomatic engagement. That is, when a quid pro quo is negotiated, there have been other ways also, but these are the two salient ways. When a quid pro quo is negotiated in return for a country's participation as a state, as distinct from communities of scientists, I want to make that distinction, using her scientific or other advantages, such as, for example, the locational advantage that we have in Tumba, which is near the magnetic equator. Actually, it passes through it. And there was the US-sponsored Tumba Equatorial Rocket Launching Station, TERLS, at the magnetic equator, which passes through Kerala, not far from Toronto. Or we have epidemiological advantages. Who sponsored vaccine trials? Why only in tropical Latin America, right here now, under COVID? Technological, for example, in the contribution in kind of subsystems. For example, for the square kilometer array in South Africa, to which we are contributing antennae, which are made, I think, in Bangalore or some place close by. Also China, I'll come to that. Or the reciprocal use of facilities. For example, the giant meter wave radio telescope in Godard, near Pune, at Arecibo in Puerto Rico. And we have exchanged, and of course, the Arecibo very large dish has been unfortunately ruined because of an accident which happened there, I think, a few months ago. It's a National Science Foundation facility set up by the United States, but it has now got to be abandoned because it's beyond repair, which leaves only GMRT. Then, of course, there are non-reciprocal offers of very unique facilities. For example, the infrared telescope, which we have in Ladakh. You could call it a kind of soft power that remains as distinct from hard power of military or economic means. And this is to influence, or has the effect of influencing, influence groups, scientific influence groups of some merit and some what I would call gambhir in their respective countries, for example, South Africa. The next slide, please.
Yes.
We're getting to the next slide.
Yes, sir.
So then the other one is what I call science-informed diplomacy. See, as human threats to the global commons become ever more severe, you've noticed that all the time. In the epidemiological area, it's rather evident. It's around us, and you feel it every day. This is being held online for that very reason. Then the global, of course, you have global warming, depletion of natural resources, in particular the bioresources, Amazon, and so on. The global diplomatic negotiations over treaty-based national actions, to mitigate them become increasingly underpinned by a common transnational appreciation of the underlying science, which, of course, the former President Trump denied and tried to deny that there was any such thing as global warming. You know, the whole thing was a hoax. He actually called it that. But I'd like to flag here in the same category of the commons, where two hardly known Indian traces exist to international science-informed diplomatic negotiations. One, of course, was the Kothari report on the effects of nuclear explosions. This was a report written by Professor Kothari and a group, which he took, or rather, then Prime Minister Nehru sent to Japan after the Second World War to study the effects of the nuclear bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they produced a report which was published by the Publications Division. It's available on the net, and I would urge you to have a look at it. And the Kothari report, which had also a member, two other people, K.S. Krishnan, or the head of the laboratory, the National Physical Laboratory in Delhi, and his deputy, a man called S. Parthasarathi, who were disputed to Japan. And when they came back, they produced this report, which formed the basis of the Kothari report on the effects of nuclear explosions. And that Kothari report had a fairly major influence, although it took a very long time, for the LTBT, that is, a limited nuclear test ban, so that at least the fallout in the atmosphere would not occur, and the ill effects of nuclear explosions, in particular the spread of leukemia, which was noticed all over Northern Europe, could be mitigated. There were other effects. But anyway, the trace to a international diplomatic negotiations which finally resulted in the limited test ban treaty, shifting the nuclear weapons test underground so that they did not have the kind of fallout, was a direct result of scientists, and in particular Indian scientists, making a report or producing a report on the effects of nuclear explosions. And then you have what is called the Kulkarni Ramanathan work, which was entered into in the late 1940s. And you go to the Physical Research Laboratory website. Physical Research Laboratory is now a constituent laboratory of the Department of Space. And Ramanathan, who was a student of C.V. Raman, worked on the vertical transport of ozone in the atmosphere. So very first one. And that led chemistry, ozone CFC chemistry, that is fluorocarbons, chlorofluorocarbon chemistry, and the interaction between ozone and chlorofluorocarbons, which reduced and which then which reduced the ozone protection to the atmosphere, and then that finally resulted in the Montreal Protocol on ozone depleting substances, CFCs. And as you all know, that these are now banned or nearly banned substances, which have to have a end date by which they are all removed from circulation, both circulation in industrial circulation and in refrigeration in particular. They're no longer going to be used. Perhaps they've been banned, and there's a leftover, which I think there is an end date. I'm not sure what that date is, possibly this year. And then there is, of course, unfortunately, what I call science disdained diplomacy. In oceans and space, commons as these domains are unusable by all nations, and that's why they're called the commons. Oceans are ecologically very fragile, and getting more so. As you gaze out right there, you go to the beach from Manipal, and you can see it happening in front of you. And despite the urgings of the scientific community of the United States in particular, the domestic ideological opposition there has been dominant enough to prevent the formal accession of the United States to the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Seas, although they have stated that they will behave as if they are signatories to that, although they will not sign it. It's one of these, what I call somersaults or attempted somersaults and leg breaks, not to say googlies, although the United States are not familiar with these cricketing terms. I don't know what the equivalent baseball term is. Curveball, maybe, to both be and not be part of UNCLOS. We must see how the new Biden administration, now, if at all, there's some indications that they may. It's not clear yet, at least not to me. Now, the sustainable use of space demands science-informed actions, and worse yet, demands actions. Of the few nations that have autonomous capabilities, such as India, to access and use their commons of space, they're disdainful of possible restraint on its freedom of action in the contested this domain. The US, in its previous administration, has declared quite flatly that it does not consider space as a commons, and space is not a commons. I mean, he actually used those words. We must see how it goes, and I have a different formulation for this, and we might come back to it during discussion. I've suggested that space should be regarded territory, which it is under the Outer Space Treaty. It's a common territory of mankind, not a commons in that sense, as the oceans are. It's called the common territory. It's defined as a territory, and as a territory, it is amenable to governance by an agency of the United Nations, which has been in dormant for a very long time now, called the Trusteeship Council. But you can come back to that during discussion, maybe. Next slide, please.
Yes.
Now, in the cyber commons, capabilities and expertise needed to mount cyber attacks and counters are more evenly resident in, resident in North and South nations. All of you know that. Many of you may well be hacks yourself. I mean, computer hacks. The richer the offended nation, the greater its economic and political pain to cyber attacks. And that's rather evident. The disruptions that can be caused to the United States, and they are feeling it, or the other countries of the North, are far greater than they are, for example, to a country like India, where we do not depend so much on an integrated. We are quite used to using the net, including in the rural areas now, but it's disaggregated. We can come back to that later. Thus, ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, have harnessed their cyber scientists and information technology specialists to build capacity and confidence between them when the diplomatic track to evolve regional cyber CBMs have run into roadblocks because of geopolitics of the ASEAN itself and their differences between them, and in particular, the attempts by some countries such as Malaysia to be top dog amongst the ASEAN countries. So they've harnessed the one-to-one contacts between their scientists, their cyber scientists, and information technology specialists to build capacity and confidence between them in the regular cyber commons between them. It's an interesting example of a sort of bypass of politics, geopolitics, by a particularly concerned and quite competent community of scientists, information technologists, in a group of countries which are otherwise at loggerheads in respect of trade and other relations. But research is accelerating to exploit quantum physics, excuse me, to segregate the cyber commons into quantum haves and have-nots, with technology controls to ensure that it stays so. If you look at the technology control list, including ours, by the way, you will find that quantum technologies are under control for export, and you will need a license, particularly from the United States and Europe, possibly now even from Japan, I'm not too sure of that, where quantum, what you know about quantum cyber, you've heard of it, I'm sure. And we have a quantum satellites where quantum physics is used to what might be called it's a kind of method by which you ensure that spying cannot take place when messages are being exchanged using, such as, for example, quantum satellites. That is, the key can also be exchanged in communications, the quantum key, so that in such a way that even someone who's eavesdropping into the communication cannot break that key. It's a complex area, and such of those who are interested can go through quite a lot of literature which is now coming out to tell you why quantum physics is being used to ensure that even if the key is transmitted through the electronic route, it cannot be broken. Next slide, please. Now, there have been shifts in the geography of science and their consequences for science diplomacy. This is becoming evident. The US and Europe, they established science superpowers, quote unquote, have dominated the research world since 1945. Yet, this Atlantic axis is unlikely to be the main focus of research by 2045 or even by 2020, that's last year. And this was said in Nature in October 2012. And it's no accident, I think, that the PM of a post-Brexit UK, from which Nature is published, as you know, termed India as a science superpower. Now, we may feel good about it, but let's not, because we are, even the use of that expression I'm not very happy with, and I'll come to that maybe in discussion. And as India and the countries of the South generally enlarge their scientific spheres of influence, diplomacy will play an increasing role in their S&T-mediated international engagements, both with the North and intra-South. And several of those engagements will be mediated by geostrategic considerations. Space is the obvious example, but also the oceans, and now increasingly in the polar regions. For example, right not too far from where you are, in Goa University, there is a Polar Regions Institute or department. It used to be called the Antarctic. It's now called Polar Regions. And as you probably know, the Antarctic Center is located right not too far in Goa. And the polar regions have become very much the focus of geopolitics, if for no other reason that the Arctic is opening up for seagoing traffic as a result of global warming. So two areas, global warming and the Arctic, and the geopolitics of both are getting connected through a single science-based or science-informed negotiating style, if you like, namely the Arctic regions on one side and global warming negotiations on the other. Next slide. That's it, I notice. Thank you very much. Thank you,
sir. So, thank you, Dr. Siddhartha, for that lecture. Now, let
Have
me.
I overstepped?
Sorry, sir.
Did I overstep my time, or was it?
No, not at all. You are right on time, sir. So now we have the Q&A session, and we have a few questions already. I think first of all, let me call Utkarsha. Utkarsha actually serves as a PhD scholar working here, and she is actually looking at this space diplomacy angle. And she is the one who had written one article which you have actually forwarded to me on that LinkWest policy in Finns. Yeah, Utkarsha, you can go ahead with your question to Dr. Siddhartha.
Good morning, sir.
Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes.
Good morning.
Yeah, it was good listening to you. I have two questions here.
I'm having difficulty understanding.
Sir, am I audible? Hello,
Can you
sir.
speak just a little louder if you could?
Yes, sir. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sir, I have two questions here. Sir, in one of your documents, you have mentioned about the typically advanced countries acting as the participant discriminator in the international arena. So, how do you see India's role as being a fairly scientifically advanced nation, being acting as a participant discriminator if it has been acquiring the high technologies in advance before the norm setting takes place? And
very good question. Yes, is that the first question?
Yes, sir. That is the first question.
Then the second one.
Yes, sir. Sir, another one was regarding the dual-use conundrum that takes place usually.
Yeah.
So I would like to during my research, one usually issue that I come across is like we talk about the segregation of commercial, civilian, and the military capabilities in the space domain. So here, what happens is when we talk about the launch capabilities being leveraged. Sometimes we are leveraging them for the launch of military or even the civilian capabilities of other nations. So there has been a gray area which has not been addressed by any of the policy that I have come across as of now. So if you have any kind of way of approaching the foreign policy initiatives which can clarify those kind of challenges, the gray areas, addressing the gray areas.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
These are very good questions. Have you applied to the United Nations to be the chair of the United Nations Conference on Space?
Not yet, sir, but I follow them.
Yeah, very good. Because your questions are absolutely front and center. Now, the point here is that we, so far, as our the whole business of diplomacy is shot through with not just dual use, but with dual standards. It's also shot through with different degrees of hypocrisy. And we are no different. In the power game, we have been kept apart until we developed our own technologies to an extent where it started threatening those who had come earlier. The moment they realized that we are getting close, they said, why don't you join us? So, if you can't beat them, you join them, or the other way around. If you can't be beaten, you're asked to be joined. That's what happened in the case of the missile technology control regime. We were discriminated against until we developed enough capabilities. The same thing is going to happen in space, and space is a gray area. And if this is a big subject, it can't be dealt with in the answer to just one question, except to say that we will be both discriminator and discriminatee for some time until our power balance gets to the point where we become possibly a full member of the UN Security Council, for example, and in the interim, when we can tailor the space regime, as I have attempted to suggest in an article which has been published on the NIAS website, on the possible reconfiguration of the UN Trusteeship Council as the basis for space governance. I do not know whether I've over-answered your question, but there are elements in your question which are grey areas and will remain grey areas because an international regime in this is. That's why I've called space a non-governed territory. I don't know whether I've answered enough.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Is there anything remaining that I need to address?
No, for the first question, it's this is what I would like to know. And other than when we talk of multi-track diplomacy, in the second question, I would like to.
When I talk, what? Sorry.
The multi-track diplomacy. Diplomacy. So now we are looking for like public diplomacy or science diplomacy as we talk about. So
who's the we? Who's the we?
Huh?
About? Who is the we who are talking about?
Sir, as India's foreign policy makers. So
right.
If they are looking at the multi-track diplomacy, so there be some regulatory mechanisms that need to be developed. So how you see means should be the essential clauses or essential regulatory points that we need to focus on initially.
Why do you want to do that if it's bilateral?
Okay. Yeah.
There's no need to do it if it's bilateral. And if it's multilateral, then it becomes science informed. That is, you don't do anything in the negotiations which go against the basic science. Right? For example, I'll give you an example. Let's say we're talking about global warming. Right? Right now, we have a situation where the atmosphere doesn't recognize natural borders.
Yes, sir.
So if you talk, for example, from a purely equity standpoint, then the per capita carbon emissions that India or even China makes, for that matter, are much lower than what they are in the United States. But the total amount of carbon, we are number 2, I think, possibly 3. China and India are next only to the United States. Now the atmosphere doesn't care about that. And whereas the diplomatic negotiations might do all this, might say, look, you're being unfair, the atmosphere will turn around and say, I don't care what you guys are going to talk about. As far as I'm concerned, I'm being ruined. So this dilemma will play out in the diplomatic field, and how it plays out will not be confined only to the atmosphere. There will be trade-offs with other regions, with other areas of diplomatic negotiation. For example, trade. That's why what will increasingly come into prominence, I think, is what I call, or what has been called by others as well, cross-domain diplomacy. That is, when you negotiate something in the area of the oceans, you don't confine it to the ocean. You say, I will not buy your fish if you insist on oceans. Or I will make sure that I will not export, or I won't buy your wheat in the event that you don't behave yourself in the atmosphere. Things like this, cross-domain diplomacy. Increasingly, this will play out, but the power relations will be different as they play out. Have I answered your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Utkarsha. Thank you, sir, for answering that question. The next question will be asked by Alina Joseph. Alina, please introduce yourself before asking the question.
Sure, sir. Hello, sir. My name is Alina. I'm a second year student at the department. My question is about how India should move ahead in its science diplomacy matters. Like talking about the current geopolitical context as such, like India being closer to geographically closer to China, and China actually kind of developing their science diplomacy through the latest COVID vaccine and all, like in the relating areas like in West Asia and even in the Indo-Pacific region. And again, when you consider how India has been evolving in the science and technology field, like starting from nuclear to outer space and cyber, when other countries were looking for weaponization or militarization, India definitely wanted more for civilian and national security aspects. So India was, I will say, when compared to other countries, India was less aggressive in this field. So in one of the slides, even the Prime Minister was saying India can be a science power in future. So considering the diplomatic matters and the ways India has been accepting, so what is your take on how India should move ahead in having like countries like China and US in the international system and to become a science superpower? What should India be doing in the current geopolitical context?
Good question, but why should India be a science superpower?
Sir, first of all, the perception in the international system when a country is a science superpower or like country have a solid science and technology basis is different. Like for the case, I'll say why India did nuclear test in the beginning, like in the first place, like it was because India wanted to be accepted like having a definite science and technology background compared to other countries like US, Soviet Union, and other countries who had nuclear power status at that time. And coming to the outer space matters, I'll say more than the perception in the international system, India wanted something to be done in the civilian aspects, like national security perspective. So science superpower, India aspires to be maybe, but more than that, India has that potential to become a science superpower. Like when you analyze all the activities that India has been doing, though India is not so aggressive, like I mentioned earlier, India has that potential to become a superpower. So in the diplomatic arena, what should India be doing? Like that was my question, sir.
That is exactly what I've tried to address in one of my slides. So we must be very, very careful, because if we do this, what you're suggesting, first of all, I think we should avoid this expression, science superpower. It doesn't make any sense, at least not to me. The point is, incidentally, we are not. I do consider Israel as more of a superpower than we are in science, as distinct from technology, but that's another matter. You see, let me go back to this. Somebody, I think, raised this issue. I've forgotten on this COVID. Was it you who were talking about this COVID vaccine thing?
Yes,
Look,
sir. Yes, sir. It was me.
Right. Now, it's really technology in itself. It is a product which sort of has come about at quote unquote the correct time. We've been a vaccine maker of some magnitude, and I think perhaps maybe even number 2 in the world, 2 or 3, and have been for quite some time. This expression of using the of superpower business is a form of subterranean arrogance, which I don't think we should be using at all. And if others want to use it, well, we can keep quiet. We don't have to say very much, feign a certain degree of modesty. But the point about it is that this vaccine diplomacy, I don't call it science and technology diplomacy. The Chinese or the Indian one, which is currently going on, it's a product diplomacy in a particular circumstance, which happens to be universal, the COVID. And it's understandable that this is being, you can get a hang. This COVID diplomacy business, you can get a hang of it only if it is seen in an overall India-China contrast and a context. And there is a very short and it's a very good characterization of all these dimensions of the India-China relationship is in chapter 6, by the way, of what is called the what he calls the NIMZO Indian defense in External Affairs Minister Jayashankar's book, The India Way, which was published last year, 2020. I would urge you to read it. Look at chapter 6, read chapter 6, and you will find that the contestations or the diplomatic play, some of which is power play, most of it is not, some of which is simultaneous with other things, like, for example, the road, the new Silk Road. It's part of the Indian Ocean, circling of India. All that is all mixed up, and it's mixed up in a way which is best understood. But if you hear it and if you read it from one of the masters of our diplomacy, T.A.M. Jayashankar, and you should read chapter 6 of his book called The NIMZO Indian Defense, and you'll get a hang of this much better than I can explain in a few words here. But yes, it is part of an overall pattern of which space is a part. And as I said, we have to play it both ways. Both a player, but you're not going to be taken seriously, as indeed what happened with our ASAT test. I have a presentation on that, which you can access in your department, and you'll find that I have a presentation on that. Until you're in a position to show your strength, you simply do not have the what I call gambhir. Nobody takes you seriously in any negotiations. You have to say, look, if you don't listen to us, you'll be hurt. That's also what happened with ASAC. That's it.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Alina, for that question. And thanks for answering that. The next question is by Vineet Krishnan. Vineet, you can ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, sir. My name is Vineet. I'm working on, I'm doing my PhD research on space security, probable challenges and prospects for cooperation in the area. And my question is actually linked to this field as well. It's a two-part question, and I'll be quick about it. Where does space security calculations rank, both in terms of confidence-building measures as well as in terms of normative cooperative mechanisms when it comes to the foreign policy calculations of a nation like India? And secondly, for India, is the latter, that is a normative cooperative mechanism under, say, the auspices of UN or something like that. Is that more of a preferred option, or would we rather be preferring operational mechanisms with strategic partners such as US, Japan, France, and so on when it comes to space security cooperation? Thank you.
Again, excellent question. Again, to track. And I would urge you to have a look at the contribution that I have made on the NIAS website, on the I3SP website, on and I think it's also on the list of references which I have made available on what I think about space security and what is in terms of the institutional basis on which the United Nations and its Trusteeship Council, for example, which has not been used, would be a very good basis, in my view. And I've said why it is my view, and I've produced, I think, something like a dozen or more than that. I think something like 24 references, which I would urge you to have a look at. Again, to track, and we have to here separate out. You see, space in and of itself, it's a complex area. In and of itself, there are only two functions that space performs, the space platform performs. That is signal reflection and remote sensing. And that's it. What you use it for remotely, for example, let us assume that there was no that airspace was not sovereign. Let us say airspace was not sovereign. If airspace was not sovereign, then I can assure you there would hardly be any satellites in low Earth orbit. You would be using aeroplanes to cross over from one territory to another and taking pictures or sending signals or reflecting signals and whatever. And bilateral arrangements between European nations are now going to allow, for example, the use of airships to reflect signals, and that may be a much cheaper way of doing things. And as for communications, you might find that in another 10 years, undersea cables with optical fibers may be preferred rather than satellite reflection. That apart, with these two functions, what you use it for is the military use, not the satellite in and of itself. If you have out-of-area operations and you use your satellite for sensing some other country, like for example China, so for example, that we are using or China uses on us, and we destroy that satellite, then it becomes an object of military action. Or if you interfere with that satellite electronically, then it becomes an object of military interference, as it were. This is again an area of negotiations currently. I really don't think it's as difficult as it's made out, as long as you don't physically destroy a satellite. The physical destruction business I've attended to in a different context, and we can discuss that later. But I really don't see why there's any need to destroy a satellite physically at all. You can disable it now in a variety of ways, including by laser blinding, for example. And then whether or not that is considered offensive action, all of this is in its own territory of negotiations, of arms control negotiations, not space negotiations. That's it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So the next question is by Anupama.
Am I audible to everyone?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening. Good morning, sir. Sorry. Sir, I have two questions. So the first question goes. So you argue in your paper that countries of the South should try to eschew neo-colonial attitudes while engaging in science diplomacy ventures. So my question is, how practical is it to do so in the current geopolitical context, especially as you rightly pointed out while answering one of the earlier questions that power is central to nation states' calculus in international relations. My second question, sir, in another part of your article, you mentioned that the point where the ramifications of S&T move beyond the S&T itself, it both influences and gets influenced by foreign policy in certain ways. So would it be right to say that it is technologies of a military relevance or technologies with a certain offensive potential that are capable of having such ramifications? Thank you, sir.
My God, very good. Two very good questions. Let me answer the first one. Yes, I think that we have to be careful, and the way in which in fact, that is currently articulating a great deal of what the Department of Science and Technology, in close collaboration with the Ministry of External Affairs, is doing. We do not say we want to collaborate in this. When we go to South Africa or some of these other countries, which are coming up on what I call the S&T scale, or even Brazil, we ask them, what is it you want to do? Not what we want to do. And then if we find it convenient, and we find it that we can make a contribution which does not give this impression of being neo-colonialist, we go ahead and do that. It's extremely important to get that done in that way. But there's an article in Current Science by Ramamurthy, who was the former V.S. Ramamurthy, who was the former secretary on international collaboration in science and technology. That's why I made this distinction. we must engage in international collaborations in such a way that we don't give the impression that we are trying any neo-colonialist posturing. That we do it in a way where the partnering country is comfortable, that its scientific communities there in those countries, for example, South Africa, for example, Kenya. Incidentally, these are not necessarily only in these areas. Let's take wildlife. In wildlife conservation, actually, we are at the receiving end. A great deal of scientific work which is being done in wildlife conservation, for example, in the biology of wildlife conservation in Tanzania and Kenya. We are in search of this. We collaborate with them in a position of recipient of their experience, vast experience in wildlife management. In respect of power relations, it comes about only in what may be called dual-use technologies. In fundamental science, like for example in collaboration in radio astronomy, in fundamental particle physics, in certain aspects of brain biology, for example, or right now in COVID, in the fundamental aspects of it. It's only your capability and a careful match so that there is not much of a differential, a mental differential between collaborating partners, which will ensure that over a period of time, neo-colonialist attitudes do not permeate or do not sort of infiltrate into one's collaborative efforts in science and technology. But they do have the potential, because of the connectivities of top scientists with their respective governments, to smooth the way to other kinds of negotiations in, for example, what I call, and I have called, cross-domain influences. I don't know whether I've answered the question.
Okay, so thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
The next question will be, sir, can you take, are you in a position to take a few more questions?
Yeah, I'm in a position to take any more questions.
Next question will be asked by Arushi Singh. Arushi, please go ahead with your question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, sir. So my name is Arushi Singh. I'm a second year student at the department. So first of all, thank you for an illuminating lecture. Sir, in one of your documents, you wrote about the denial of the use of technology due to foreign policy imperatives. However, sir, are there some circumstances or some parameters which warrant the withholding of technology, especially by the global north to the global south? Thus, my second question is, as humans aim to become an interplanetary species and also to address the Fermi paradox, as such, how can science diplomacy be leveraged in the era of space travel to advance the interest of India and the global south? Sir, my third question is about a document that I came across which referred to science and diplomacy as being effectively constituting two solitudes which really intersect. Furthermore, sir, there are differences in principal elements of diplomacy and science. For instance, diplomacy is concerned with risk aversion while science is concerned with risk tolerance, and diplomacy is concerned with balancing power while science is concerned with unleashing power. So my question is this dichotomy or solitary confinement of science and diplomacy a perception or a reality? Thank you, sir.
Look, the point about question, the point about open-endedness, the point about power relations coming sort of in respect of the contradiction that you tried to point out. Can you get back to that, the last one? If I don't remember that entirely correctly, you said something about there being a contradiction between the openness of science.
Yes, Sir, about balancing power, diplomacy is concerned with balancing power, while science is concerned with unleashing power.
No. This is where I think that you will have to. No. This is where you'll have to separate out science from technology. Technology is an instrumentality of balancing power. Science, in and of itself, is not. Excepting in some cases where the science is looked at as sufficiently dual use, as it were, when deployed, like, for example, quantum technology. But let's take 4 areas. I usually separate these two. Say when you're looking at the 4 areas, which are the 4 areas? Origin of matter, origin of life, origin of thought, and shall I say the origin of the universe. All right, these 4 areas are sufficiently pure science where the collaborative effort is determined not so much by the science, but by the sociology of the communities. Are you comfortable with the other scientific communities that are collaborating in these areas comfortable? And in that, I don't think that the foreign policy or the foreign elements in this have much of a salience, with one exception. I'll come to that. And that's in the supply of equipment. For example, in the supply of the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, we have supplied from the Saha Institute, I think in Calcutta. Yeah, that's right. Muon detectors, some particle detectors, very large ones. Now, to the extent that this has a certain salience, and our collaboration is in kind, we have made offers of equipment in kind, and our in-kind collaboration has resulted, for example, in a certain amount of time that is available to India's physicists to spend time at the Large Hadron Collider without having to pay for it. This kind of collaborative effort, internationally or even bilaterally, as I had mentioned with respect to the telescope in Ladakh, these are very largely science-driven. They are not or question-driven, or is it worthwhile doing this exercise-driven? That's how it starts. It might end up in a bit of a diplomatic negotiation, but it's a diplomatic negotiation which is aimed at facilitating the process, not at stopping it, or at controlling it, or at guiding it, but at facilitating the process. Not so in the case of technology. In the case of technology, it's very much a question of quid pro quo. What am I getting? What am I giving? And is the balance about right in the present geopolitical circumstances that we find ourselves in with respect to that country or countries, plural, and ourselves for that matter? Are we spending enough? Do we have enough scientists to spare, particularly young ones like yourselves? Or are we satisfied with advice being given by retired scientists, for example, which doesn't cost very much from the point of view of foregone advice domestically? Have I answered the question, or is something left?
Sir, you have answered the question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Arushi, your earlier question, interplanetary travel.
Sir, so my question was also about humans becoming an interplanetary species and also the Fermi paradox.
What is the Fermi paradox?
Sir, it's about where is everyone else, as there are multiple planets out there. There must be other life forms. Yes, sir. So the leveraging of science diplomacy
where is the leverage? You're stuck with the speed of light.
Yes, sir.
There's nothing you can do about that. Right now, for example, by the way, this is an interesting question. Whatever we do in interplanetary work right now, we start planning now, say. In fact, that's another topic for the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto and Uranus. Nothing that we do will be of any consequence except for your generation's children. By the time the samples come back, by the time the signals come back, you will be in the driving seats, and those who plan for these missions will have to consider the fact that the results will have to be analyzed by those who are in the next generation who may not even be born yet. That's a constraint in a way. So I don't really think there's much diplomacy involved there, except that what I have called this, this is silly. This Me Too space Tarzan, this me. You're a young lady, so you know about this Me Too movement, I think. So I've sort of taken it off and called it the Me Too space Tarzan approach. This is silly. This is juvenile. America is getting caught in it at this present moment of time, and all sorts of silly. And I've made some comments on it in blog sites, and it is not representative of either of two civilizational states, like for example the Chinese and us, to start behaving in the space Tarzan way. Incidentally, in about 10 years' time, the aging populations of Japan, Europe, and Japan and Europe, and possibly some parts of the white populations of America, will have a very different attitude towards space Tarzanism in 10 years than what we might have, or what the Chinese may have, or what the Brazilians may have. So here, the demographic change for missions which take more than a decade to fructify, which is about now. I mean, you start now, they won't fructify for a decade at least, will be very different, and their attitudes to space Tarzanism as a international posturing, if you like, and its effects will be very different. I don't think the Chinese even are going to be, in 10 years' time, are going to be very impressed by saying we are number one in going to the other side of the moon and so on. So the basis for assessment of the worthwhileness of a space science will have to be science-driven rather than Me Too space-driven. So I think. Thank you.
Yes, sir. If I could ask a supplementary question. Sir, Elon Musk is right now working on Neuralink. Sir, if we don't age during space flight, so what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I've aged already to have no thoughts on it at all. Because I don't know. I think these issues of astrobiology is something that you will have to look at. Whether the slowing, I mean, this whole question about aging and the so what question, the why question will be salient. Yeah, so what if Elon Musk does what he wants to do, or if somebody goes? I really don't think that this will have, except for the excitement will die down, I think. But I don't know. It's for you young people to ask and address the question. I probably belong to a generation which doesn't really think too much about space Tarzanism.
Thank you, sir, for introducing us to that new term. The next question is by, I think the final question, by Daksh Sharma. Daksh, please go ahead.
So, Daksh, my name is Kulika, second year student in this department. Thank you, sir, for the lecture.
Can you slow down? Sorry, we can't hear you properly. Can you just come closer to the mic and speak a little more slowly and louder?
Yes, sir. Is it audible now, sir?
Yes.
Yes. So my name is Kulika Bhattacharjee and I'm a second year student at this department. Thank you, sir, for the lecture. So what I wanted to ask is that while science is assumed to be universal since it utilizes empirical evidences and facts, But when it comes to climate change, what may be the reasons for different countries to have a different perspective in the scientific evidence? And is science also in a way dependent on different ideological perspectives?
You asked some very, very important questions. If it's really good science, which as you say is data-based, experiment-based, and you can get a consensus on the rightness or the wrongness of the experiment, the rightness or the wrongness of the result, which of course is always within a certain gap or within a certain band of uncertainty, everywhere in all science. If the precautionary principle applies, what if we are wrong? It doesn't matter if you're wrong on the right side, as it were. That is, if you're not taking, if you go wrong and you've underestimated the carbon footprint, for example, then you can be in very serious trouble. And an extinction of the human civilization is possible in 100 years. But if you take the precautionary principle and say, look, we'd better be safe than sorry, and the evidence indicates this, as it's happening right now in the Arctic and in the polar regions with respect to global warming and the ice melting and the sea level rise. Even if you're skeptical about the entire validity of the science, it's not wrong. It may not be wholly right. But if it's not wrong, better to take the precautionary principle and say, we better take adequate steps just in case the worst estimate comes out to be right. From policy perspective, both from technology and from the point of view of public policy, it's always better to use the precautionary principle. But that gets you right into your ideological position with respect to free markets and controls and so on and so forth. So that is why technology is very much at the heart of political economy, because like land, labor, and capital, the ownership of the output of the mind is also very much a subject or a, if you like, a factor of production, a factor of idea production, a factor of real production. And the ownership of the real factor of production, or the ownership of the idea factor of production, and the way in which global groups sanctify an idea or say that this is now received wisdom, and the sociology of that around the world makes a very big difference to the acceptance or the non-acceptance within a certain paradigm, within a certain paradigm, until it changes very, 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 very drastically. And you're right, these very drastic changes are determined, at least to some extent, if not to a large extent, by power relations between not just countries, but power relations between scientific groups within countries. It makes a difference of whether a person of Indian origin happens to be the current president of the Royal Society or not. Have I answered the question? I don't know.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Purnika. Is there any other question from the classroom? That was actually a question from the classroom.
Yes, sir. I have one more question. It's Daksh.
Yeah, Daksh, go ahead.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, sir. My question was, when it comes to our foreign policy or diplomatic engagements in terms of science and technology, should more emphasis be there on collaborating more with established technological powers, or should we orient ourselves towards building capacities in what we call the global south? The benefit I see in the second part is we can reorient the, so to say, the order in such like, you mentioned the Atlantic axis, etc. Do we build up capacity in the global south and redefine the order of what constitutes openness, what is good science, what is good technology, and who should be the discriminator, or how open should science be?
Again, very good question. I think we'll have to do both and play between what is done at what time and with whom and on what subject will depend on circumstances which are, but, and I think this is important, we should not, it is to India's advantage in its general, because of the, what I call, and I think here this is where I return to the international Varna order. Whites on top, which are aging, then yellows, who are trying to make their, which are trying to leverage themselves. Some of the yellows are aging, browns like us, and blacks. And in this international Varna order, we should try very, very hard not to behave in a color conscious way at all. It can become very, very toxic and start treating, for example, African countries as if they were lower down in the science pecking order. And this depends on face-to-face negotiations, the way in which we get our students, the way in which we treat our students here in black students, for example, here in Delhi University and other places. They're very bad. And these attitudes simply have to go. And if we don't, we'll be in very serious trouble, because just as we graduated, are causing trouble, rightly, to our colonial masters, or what were colonial masters. Let me assure you that unless we behave ourselves properly with those in the lower pecking order, as we put it ourselves, we first of all shouldn't consider it that way. And if we do inadvertently and otherwise, we should really, really be very careful in our interpersonal relations with scientists from other countries, particularly those with the same color orientation, browns and blacks. I don't know whether I've answered the question rather bluntly.
No, of course, sir. You answered the question. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Daksh. Thank you, sir, for answering these questions. With that, we have come to the end of this distinguished online lecture by Dr. Sri Siddhartha. I would like to thank him from the bottom of my heart for giving so much of knowledge, so much of varied and uncommon perspectives, which we normally don't get to read or interact with. So thank you for giving us so much of knowledge, and I am very sure that a lot of the students here are motivated by interacting with you to look more towards the science and technology aspects of geopolitical international relations. With that, I would also like to thank Dr. Nandkishore, who is head in charge of the department, for helping us coordinate this lecture. Also, special thanks to Dr. Manish Tarangbam for helping us with this lecture. I would also like to especially thank Dr. Dhanasri Jayaram, because it was during our discussions that we thought that we should actually bring you and get our students this whole new kind of perspective about how science and technology can be viewed in international relations, because we during our student days also learned a lot from you, and whatever you have spoken then actually it has stayed in our head for quite a long time, especially the Varna, international Varna system. I would also extremely like to thank the students who have gathered here, especially the ones who have asked very, very incisive questions. It showed how they're interested they are in this particular aspect, and also the others who were listening to, especially at a time when we are having a very tight schedule here, because their term paper presentations are happening next week. So they are in their last leg of preparations for that. So thank you for attending the lecture. And also I would like to finally thank all the external participants from other organizations outside Manipal and within Manipal, outside the department, for coming and listening to the lecture and making it a huge success, I would say. Thank you all for being a part of this lecture. And to Dr. Siddhartha, we would certainly love to hear more about your perspectives on these issues, maybe at a later time. So we are expecting more of your participation, more of your part to be played in the department in the coming semesters and coming years.
Thank you very much indeed for having me. It's been a pleasure and it's been a new experience, and I'm particularly enamored by the very sharp questions and very pointed, very sharp and very relevant questioning that has been thrown at me, and I only hope that I have answered it in a way that would stimulate further thought on the part of your students, and I would encourage them to engage in this area with the subject matter apart from others, both nationally and internationally, including the person that you mentioned from Korea, who has been in India, by the way, and has spent time here at JMU. I know her, and it's G from JI. I probably got the name right. Yes, so thank you very much indeed, and I look forward to further interactions. I'll have to bone up, and I would ask, as for the China question particularly, for you to read that book and that chapter, which I had an occasion to mention, chapter 6, which I had occasion to mention.
We will do that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.